So far we haven't really talked much about iterators. And the reason for this is because it's a little bit easier to understand iterators and closures at the same time, since it's difficult to create an iterator in Lua without a closure. So what we're going to do in this example is we're going to create a simple iterator, and then hopefully you'll be able to learn two concepts at the same time. You'll be able to see how a closure works as we create the iterator, and see how iterators work as we use the iterator. So I'm just going to go ahead and create a new file here, and I'm going to save this, and we're going to call this one simple counter.lua. And what we're going to do here is we're going to start off by creating an iterator, and this iterator is going to use a closure. Now, the goal of an iterator is basically going to be to return some set of values. Now, typically, you're going to want to loop through something or return successive values. So if you can imagine, if you had, let's say, a list of names, you might have an iterator that would go through and return each name in succession every time that iterator is called. In our case, we're just going to make an iterator that's going to be able to count. So we're going to make a function, and we're going to call this simple counter, and it's going to take in a max value that it's going to count up to. Then what we're going to do in here is we're going to create a local variable called count, and we're going to set it equal to 0. This is the variable that we're going to be using as a closure. Then after this, we're going to return an actual function out of here. We're going to return an anonymous function. So we're going to say return function, and then we're going to do an end. And then inside here is this function that we're going to be creating. So it's a little bit hard sometimes to get your mind wrapped around this, but we're in a function, and what our function does is it takes in a value, that's going to be the max, it returns another function that will go ahead and return a value. So you can think of this as like a factory of functions. This function, the simple counter function, is a factory that creates another function. So let's go ahead and add the body of this. So we're going to say count equals count plus 1. So we're going to increment that count variable. We're going to say if count is greater than max, then we want to return nil. And then we're going to return count otherwise. Now, when we return nil from this iterator, this basically is going to trigger the end of the iteration. So whatever's using this iterator, and our for loop is really what's going to be using the iterator, when it gets back nil, it knows that it's done. We've reached the end of that list or whatever that iterator was iterating over. So now let's go ahead and try and use this, and it'll make a little bit more sense as we use this. So we're going to use our generic for loop. We're going to say for v in simple counter 50. We're just going to count to 50. We're going to do print v. Let's go ahead and indent this, and then we're going to say n. So what we're doing is we're basically saying, okay, look, we have this simple counter. This is an iterator function. We're passing in 50. It's going to return to us this function. The function it creates, we're going to repeatedly call, and every time we call it, we're going to do what's in here. We're going to print v. We're going to get the value back from calling that. Now, once we get back a nil from this function, this anonymous function we get back from our simple counter iterator, we're going to consider ourselves done. So let's go ahead and run this now. And you can see our output that we get all the way up to 50, and then we're done. So the two important concepts here, if we can pull them out from this. The first one is that we are using a closure. And this is going to take a little bit of study if you've never used closures before, but we have this local variable count. We are actually able to access it from this function, this anonymous function here, that's been returned outside of our simple counter. Normally, when simple counter is done executing, and it'll be done when we return this function, this would be gone and we wouldn't be able to access this anymore. But because Lua has seen that inside of our anonymous function, we've accessed this variable that exists in our simple counter function, it's basically put in place a mechanism to be able to keep track of this and let us continue to use this thing. And we've even updated it. See, this is what's happening every time that this function is called, it's actually updating that count. So we're getting back a different value every time until we hit the max, and then we're getting back nil. So that's the first concept of a closure. Now the second concept here is of an iterator, and like I said, an iterator is just going to return values successively until it hits the end of what it's iterating over. It will return a nil, and when it returns a nil, then this generic for knows that it's done. So we can use an iterator or create an iterator for a variety of purposes. There's a bunch of built-in ones. We've already seen a few of them in Lua, but it's a simple way to loop through some things. And usually when you create an iterator, you're going to utilize a closure and also an anonymous function that you're going to return.